Hey YouTube, what is going on? Thanks for checking out the Straight SRT8 YouTube channel where we discuss all things SRT8 related. Now today is going to be the third and the final video on my mini series of brake components, brake installation, and now we're at tips and tricks. So I have a sheet in front of me with a lot of information I wrote down, what I want to cover. Now, most of this is going to be covered in my components video, which is episode 1 of the mini series, and then in the install episode 2 of the mini series. However, there are some things not included in either the install or in the components section that I'm going to highlight here. Get into maintenance, some PMs, installations, and stuff like that. So let's get right into it. So this is really about tips and tricks. So I'm going to start off with maintenance. Maintenance is extremely important to prolonging the life of your components, making the car easier to drive, easier to enjoy, and more predictable. And now by that I mean by doing your PMs earlier on, you're going to have a set cost. You know what that cost is going to be, and you can do your, like, say, oil changes every so often, or transmission fluid changes, or brake changes, whatever it may be. But they're known costs at known periods versus waiting until the very last minute where maybe it breaks. Then you have a higher cost, disruption to your schedule. And it's much more frustrating, makes the car much less enjoyable. So I'm a huge proponent of doing PMs. That's what this first category is going to be, is maintenance. So let's get out of the car real quick, walk through some of these things, make sure you guys are aware of them, and give you some tips and tricks. So we're going to start off by doing PM, talking about maintenance on our rotors, our brake pads, and of course our wheels. So we're starting off with certain noises. So one obvious noise is a grinding, rubbing, or a riding noise, meaning that it sounds like something's touching your wheel while it's spinning. Now, one thing that can sometimes cause that issue is behind your rotor there's a splash shield. That's to protect your rotor from getting splashed with cold water when it's really hot. Protects from dings from rocks flying up and all that good stuff. Your splash shield sits behind the rotor on the other side, from the inside of the vehicle facing outwards. And if that's rubbing against your rotor, you're going to hear that grinding, rubbing, riding noise. Any other noise similar to that, if it's coming from your wheels, is typically anything touching your rotor assembly. Now that can mean that you got a stick stuck in there. It can mean that you have a piece of components hanging down from the car, that you have some damage, whatever it may be. But that riding noise, if it's coming right from here, and it's very obvious coming from here, that's typically what it is, just that splash shield. Not a huge concern. Now you can kind of tell where noise is coming from because your wheels obviously have one rotation. So if you hear something like clicking, you know that's on the rotor itself, and they can almost predict where it's going to occur. And if you look at your SRT emblem or in between two posts, make it a marker. If your wheels are dirty, put a line like this like I did. If you hear it every time you rotate past this area, you know it has to do with something that's rotating with the vehicle. It's got a normal rhythm to it. For example, if it was like a splash shield, some part of your under your wheel well that was loose, it'd be irregular. It'd be happening, stop, happening, stop, happening, stop. But if it's something that's rotational, that's actually attached to your car, it's going to be cyclic. It's going to occur again and again and again and be very predictable. That's how you know that there is a known issue on something rotating versus something static that's irregular. Alright, so we covered kind of grinding, rubbing, riding noises. Now I'll talk about squealing. So squealing is quite a bit different. So squealing can occur for many reasons, but two major reasons are if you have dirty brake pads. So on our brake pads, there are these slits right here, and these ones are actually full of dirt and debris. These slits, as your rotor rubs over the brake pad, allows for dust to come in here and then kind of pulls it back out to allow it to maintain stuff as clean as possible, to maintain friction against this brake pad without having like rocks, dirt, or debris interfacing with the rotor and the pad. This helps minimize that, to have just the pad interface with the rotor to get maximum stopping force. If these are dirty, you're going to hear a squealing sound where you have like rocks actually stuck inside here and wedged in there, and those are going to push against the rotor, making a lot of noises. If that happens, you're going to be able to see wear marks in your rotor. So you'll see a divot where it had more significant wear compared to the rest of the rotor. That's caused by dirty pads, by having rocks or debris in between your rotor and your pad itself. So it's pretty obvious. You'll be able to see a very clear indication of a divot inside your rotor. Another reason can be from overheating either your pads or overheating your rotors. So let's say you have a one-piece rotor setup, not meant for racing. Your pads aren't meant for racing, and you went racing on your pads and hit the brakes extremely hard for a very long time. Maybe you're going down a very steep hill or something like that. If you're trying to put a lot of pressure on these pads that they're not designed for, they're going to get glossy, and so is your rotor. It's going to become very, very glossy, and when you touch it, It's going to feel very, very smooth. Now that is caused from overheating your rotors and overheating your pads. Now that's going to cause a squealing noise. Now again, it could be dirt and debris, but if you're riding your brakes extremely hard and they've cooled down and now they're super, super glossy, and you hear a constant squealing noise and it's not dirty, it's going to be because they were glossed over and they got a little bit too hot. So keep in mind there are other reasons besides those two, but those are two main reasons that you'd have that kind of noise in your vehicle. Next is clicking. If you're driving, you hear that constant rotational cyclic click. A couple of reasons for that too. If you have a two-piece setup, typically that clicking noise is because your screws here, these bolts that hold your outer ring to your inner hub, these guys right here, typically they're loose. And then when you try and brake, there's that shifting of your outer ring compared to your inner hub. And if they're loose, then the holes get wider and wider and wider, and they get this kind of shifting going on. So clicking noise is indicative. If you have two-piece rotors, can be that right there. Other things can be actual damage to the rotor. Again, if you have a nick in your rotor and it's rubbing over in your pads, every time it hits the peg, you're going to hear that clicking sound. So that can usually be associated with some kind of damage or some kind of loose assembly. It can also be if your wheel is loose to your rotor, or if it wasn't installed properly and they were kind of cockeyed to each other. You're going to hear that clicking sound as the car naturally tries to seat itself. You're going to have a little bit of wobble in your wheel. You should be able to feel that, obviously, but that could be another point of clicking noises inside your brake assemblies. Next, we get the shaking. So shaking is kind of very similar to the clicking noise if you have a loose assembly. So this, I mean, when you install your rotor, it's supposed to be flush, as I talk about in my video, and then your wheel goes over there and you hold it flush, and then you start screwing these down by hand, tightening them. Do max torque by hand, and then use your impact gun, low torque and star pattern, high torque star pattern, and then final torque wrench star pattern. If you don't do that, if you try and do tightening these two, you're going to pull this wheel in and the back end's going to naturally ride out. It's not going to be flush. Now when you torque it down, it's not going to actually flush to the vehicle. So you're going to have a wobbling and shaking sound. Now this is pretty easy to identify because when you're sitting in your seat of your car, if you feel it in your steering wheel, that means that it is vibration occurring in the front of your car and your front wheels. If you feel it in your seat, it means it's occurring in the back of the car. So make sure when you're driving down the road, on top of listening to your vehicle, try and understand the feelings and vibrations. If you see your steering wheel shaking, you know it has to be coming from the front, and if you feel it in your seat, it has to come from the back of the car. That'll help identify where your shaking is coming from and that vibration is occurring. Now again, as long as you follow this procedure properly, you shouldn't have shaking and vibration. However, there are instances where it will. Even if you install these brakes properly, you can get warpages. So let's say again you have a one-piece rotor setup and you drove it pretty hard. If you have a very hot outer ring and a very cool center hub, as that heat transforms back and forth, you're gonna get some warpages, and that's gonna cause your rotor not be perfectly flat. When that happens, it's gonna be kind of riding like this as it's warped, and you're gonna feel that occur in the car and have constant warpages, which is gonna result in vibrating and shaking. So keep aware of that too. If you installed it recently and your car starts shaking, you probably did a bad job installing it, or someone did a bad job. It isn't perfectly flush. However, if you did a brake job recently and it works fine, and then over time you get that shaking issue, it's probably due to warped rotors. Now, I do talk about the ability to have your rotors turned down. So you can go to a shop, you can pay them to turn down your rotors, and that's going to make them flush again. They put them on a lathe and they make sure they're perfectly perpendicular, which would be like having a brand new set of rotors. However, it is going to remove material off of your rotor. So if you're already at the end of your life of your rotor, turning them isn't going to help you at all. You got to replace them. However, if you're at the beginning of the life of your rotor and they weren't installed right or they got warped, you can get them turned down in order to make them smooth again and basically have a brand new pair of rotors. So those are kind of some quick ways to understand noises, vibrations, and whatnot going on with your brake assemblies as soon as you install it. Next, I want to get into how to maximize the life of your components. So obviously, the more braking force you put on your components, the faster they're going to wear down, the hotter they get, the more warped they can get. So common sense here tells you to make sure that you brake gradually. So versus braking hard and fast, if you brake slow and longer, you're going to have less force exerted on your rotors and on your pads. It's going to have more time for the dust and debris to kind of fly out of a vehicle and make sure that you don't clog up your pores here for these lines. And it's going to make sure the car doesn't get too hot and cause warping. So more gradual braking, of course, is going to be your friend. However, if you're street racing or if you're in a drag strip, of course, that's designed to do such and you have the proper components for it, won't be an issue. I'm just saying in order to prolong the life of your brakes, that's one good option. Now this setup I had the Brembo's 2-piece up fronts, 1 piece in the rears, had the Brembo pads. I got 60,000 miles out of the front rotors. Could have gone longer, not much longer, maybe 65,000 out of that. The pads were changed once, so I had my second set of pads. You can see right here. Definitely got quite a bit of life left in them. Typically though, I never recommend putting used pads on new rotors. Your rotors are brand new, they're perfectly flush. Your pads probably aren't. Just over time they get warped, or they may not be installed properly, they may have improper wear. So usually you don't want to put used pads on new rotors. However, if your rotors are still good and your pads are worn out, you need to replace your pads, of course you want to just change your pads and not change out your rotors. That's one quick thing. Another thing is annual PM. So annually, I take my brakes off and I clean them out. I pull apart my calipers and I make sure that the pad lines right here, that they are cleaned out. There's no material inside there, no dirt and debris. And then I make sure that the pads or the rotors themselves are cleaned, and that there's no indicative signs of wear that's premature. And then make sure that the caliper housing itself, or the pad's ride, is cleaned out as well, to make sure there's smooth engagement and disengagement of the pad to the caliper, and of course the pad to the rotor itself. So just doing typical PMs like this is going to make you aware of issues that may be coming soon. So again, if you had an issue where your pads weren't wearing right, or your rotor wasn't wearing right, by doing an annual PM, you're going to notice that and be able to address it, versus not knowing till it's too late and having an emergency situation. So PM, again, huge fan of that. And then the next thing is making sure you buy the right components for your vehicle. If your goal of your vehicle is to be a weekend warrior, you may not need a 2-piece setup. If your goal is to track the car, then you definitely need a 2-piece setup. So just keep in mind that you buy parts that suit your needs. If your goal is to be budget friendly, you want to do a 1-piece rotor assembly, you want to do cheaper pads, perfectly fine, nothing wrong with that. Just keep in mind that if you try and drag the car, especially if you're going out on a very hot day, say it's a Saturday, you're dragging, you pay $100 to get the drag race all day, and you do it constantly, your brakes are going to get extremely hot, and they're probably going to work themselves. I'm not saying they will, but they probably will. That's going to cause you to have premature wear on the rotor. It's going to be warped. It's going to be wobbling. You're going to get premature wear on your pads. And of course, you're going to have that extended wear and shorter lifespan. So just make sure that you buy components suited for your needs. If you're doing it once in a while, not a big deal. But that's another kind of quick tip and trick to make sure that you get the best life out of your pads and rotors as possible. Next, I want to talk about components. So these are semi-metallic pads. Typically, for most scenarios, these are going to be your best option for your SRTs. Whether you're tracking the car, whether you're a daily driver, whether you have 2-piece rotors, 1-piece rotors, typically semi-metallic pads are going to be your best friend, your best bang for your buck for SRTs in general. I talked about 2-piece versus 1-piece in previous videos. Huge difference there is just cost. Again, buying whatever you need. Make sure you don't splurge something you don't need, unless of course you're going for the look. But if you're trying to be more budget friendly, 1-piece rotors are perfectly fine. Just keep in mind that they may warp under extreme conditions. Now next I want to get into what to look for in terms of components for wear and tear. So I'll bring you over to my rotor setup and my brake pads and kind of go over that quick. Alright, so now we're going to talk about actual wear and comparing components themselves. I want to start by talking about pads. So when you do your brake change, check out your pads. Compare the 2 pads you have on each tire and make sure they have even wear across them. If they don't, it means that either your pistons are stuck or your pads are stuck inside your caliper and they're not moving. So both pads should be moving freely. So they're like this on the rotor. They should both be pushing in together to get wear and tear evenly across both pads. However, if one's stuck and only one's moving, or if this one's way back here and your rotor's right here only pushing against the one pad, you're going to have much less wear, much less life on one pad and much greater life on the other pad. That means that your pads actually aren't wearing properly and that they're jammed inside your assembly. PM is going to show you that. Another issue is that if the front of your pad here is thick and the back is very minimal or very lean, it means your pads aren't sitting flush to your rotor, they're actually kind of cockeyed. And again, that's going to be show itself in PM. So make sure that whenever you change out your brake pads, if you do your annual PM or biannual, whatever it may be, make sure you actually inspect your components and understand if they're wearing correctly or if they're too worn. If you're missing this slit, they're too worn. If this slit here is gone and they're perfectly flush, they're too worn, needs to get changed out. Look for even wear patterns across the face of the components to make sure they're good. Now when it gets to actual rotors themselves, if you have slits in your rotors like I do, and this slit is still noticeable, you can feel it with your finger, your rotors are fine, assuming that they're not warped. But if this slit is perfectly flush, it's time to change out your rotors. They're going to be at the end of their life. Same goes for your two-piece rotor assemblies. As you can see right here, these ones are much more worn. Still have some life in them, maybe another 5,000 or so miles, something like that. But if they are warped, of course, they're going to be shot. So one quick check, again, look for that slit. Now another thing to understand when you're installing these, make sure you install them correctly. Some rotors, like these ones from Brembo, are directional. Other ones, like my current DBAs, are not directional. So when you're installing it, make sure that you have it facing this way on the car. So when I have this top slit facing towards your caliper here. Other brakes may be differently, but typically that's how they go for slots. They are directional. If you don't put it in correctly and put it on backwards, you're going to have much less life on your pads, and they're going to wear out extremely fast. So make sure you install your components correctly, and that they are directional, you install them properly. One other thing, a quick mention, is when you're looking at worn rotors, this one you can see there's no embedding material, there's no defects, there's no divots in the face of the rotor, and same goes for this one, which tells you that there was no rocks in here. Again, this kind of goes back to my previous comment of squealing noises. If you have squealing, make sure that there's no divots in your rotor. If there are, it can indicate that there was a material that is stuck inside your pad that's riding against your rotor and causing that issue. So just make sure that when we check that, again, annual PM to make sure that's not occurring. Alright, so now we're at the installation portion of the video. We covered maintenance, we covered PM, covered choosing proper components, talked about wear and tear on components and understanding how they look after you're doing your annual PMs. Now we're getting into installations. So a few tips and tricks associated with proper installation. First one is make sure you remove this master cylinder cap. Whenever you're changing your pads out, you're going to compress your cylinders on your calipers, which is going to cause that fluid to go back inside your master cylinder and go against the way it's used to going. Instead of going from here down, it's going to go from down up. So make sure you loosen this cap to allow the pressure to release so you don't blow out your master cylinder. When it comes to installation of rotors, we talked about it previously, but I want to emphasize it again. If you have directional rotors, make sure you install them correctly. In case of DBAs, they are non-directional. Typically, if you have a flush rotor with no cross drilling, cross slotting, anything crazy like that, then there is no wrong versus right installation typically. When it comes to slits in the rotors or cross drilling, there usually is a proper installation method. Talking about changing out components, keep in mind that you need an E20, which is an E-Torx bit for changing out the parts on your brakes for the front assemblies. So this component right here, this is mentioned in one of my previous videos. I have the link, I'll provide it below as well. It's on Amazon, I think it was like 20 or something bucks or whatever it was. Awesome parts for that. We'll talk about doing brakes again. One thing to keep in mind is that brake fluid will eat through your paint. So you want to do the best thing you can to make sure that you don't have any brake fluid leaking out of your reservoir. So typically, if you're going to do brakes, if you're doing them all around, you want to do your fronts. When you go ahead and, again, compress your pistons, of course, you're going to have that fluid go back from the caliper up into the reservoir. So when you're done with doing that, you're going to have your reservoir levels rising quite a bit. So if you're doing fronts and backs, before you go to the backs, make sure you stop, depress the brake in your car. In order to have that fluid go back from the reservoir back into your pistons, so go ahead and press the brake all the way down in order to roll your reservoir levels. That's to make sure that this isn't going to overflow on you, which again is pretty crucial. And then go ahead and do your back set. And then for the backs, keep in mind too, there is a parking brake back here. It is located on the inside of this rotor. Mine were perfectly fine. I had 61,000 miles in the car. My rear parking brake was perfectly fine, had no reason to change it out. I recommend leaving them alone. They are a pain in the butt to do. So if you are changing your rear rotors and rear pads out, keep in mind that not every rear assembly allows you to have and to retain the engagement of your parking brake. Some of them don't allow for that to occur. So if you're going to buy a rear rotor, make sure that, it kind of personal preference, but make sure that it is capable of engaging and utilizing your parking brake, because not all of them do. I do know that the DBAs I purchased do retain that parking brake feature. So a quick tidbit when it comes to pursuing and purchasing rear rotor assemblies. Next thing that's it's pretty important is when it comes to torquing this down. I covered it previously, but make sure that you take the time to seat your rotors properly to your hub, and then to push your wheel and seat it properly and flush to your rotor, and then go ahead and start engaging your lug nuts by hand. If you try and use an impact gun immediately, you have a very high chance of cross-threading and stripping your lug nuts bolts, which you obviously don't want to do because it's a pain about to pull them back out. So go ahead and do them all by hand. That's what I always do. I put my knees on both corners of the wheel to keep it flush and centered. And then I go ahead and I push hard, and then I start tightening everything down by hand. And then I go into a star pattern on low torque for the torque gun, high torque for the torque gun. And then finally use a torque wrench to finish everything off. That's going to ensure that your wheel is perfectly flush, and that your whole car and your whole brake assembly sits right and rides right. So, quick glance at my cheat sheet, and that is everything. As always, if you guys have questions, go ahead and drop comments below. I am sure I am missing some PM stuff for our vehicles, so go ahead, drop comments below, let me know what I'm missing, and let's start a discussion. If you have questions or comments on anything I talked about on this brake video for tips and tricks, again, go ahead, drop comments below. Look forward to talking to you guys, and I have new videos coming out soon.